There is a point in every human life where comfort stops being comforting and starts becoming a cage. It is subtle at first. You call it stress, then distraction, then bad timing, then external pressure. But if you observe closely enough, you begin to notice a pattern. Your attention is not your own. Your reactions are not chosen. Your emotions are being pulled, not directed. And slowly, without you noticing, your life becomes something that happens to you instead of something you shape. The Stoics understood this with unnerving clarity. They did not build their philosophy for calm mornings and easy circumstances. They built it for disruption, for loss, for humiliation, for uncertainty, because they knew something most people avoid admitting. If your peace depends on the outside world behaving properly, then you do not have peace at all. You have dependence dressed up as stability. At the center of Stoic thinking lies a single dividing line that most people refuse to honor in practice, even if they understand it intellectually. Some things are within your control. Most things are not. Your judgments, your intentions, your discipline, your choices in response to events, these belong to you. Everything else does not. The past, the opinions of others, economic shifts, sudden misfortune, praise, rejection, betrayal, timing, none of these are yours to command. Yet people spend their entire lives trying to control the uncontrollable. They negotiate with reality as if persistence alone can bend it. They replay conversations, try to manage perceptions, obsess over outcomes, and build emotional dependence on results that were never guaranteed. This is where suffering multiplies, not from events themselves, but from the illusion that events should have obeyed you. The first act of true Stoic discipline is not emotional suppression. It is recognition. The moment you clearly see what is not yours to control, a quiet separation begins inside you. You stop leaking energy into outcomes that do not answer to you. You stop negotiating with randomness. You begin to understand that freedom is not found in controlling more of life, but in needing less from it. This shift changes everything. Because once you accept this division, your focus tightens. Your attention returns home. Instead of scattering your mind across 1,000 external uncertainties, you begin to refine what is actually yours. Your next action, your response, your self-control in the moment of pressure, the quality of your thinking. These become the only real battleground. And here is where most people underestimate Stoicism. They think it is passive acceptance. It is not. It is aggressive internal responsibility. It demands that you become precise with yourself. No excuses, no emotional outsourcing, no blaming circumstances for decisions you secretly made. Marcus Aurelius did not write his reflections from a place of comfort. He ruled an empire while confronting war, plague, betrayal, and political instability. Yet his focus was not on controlling the empire. It was on controlling the ruler within himself. That distinction is everything. Because empires collapse, reputations shift, allies turn, but the internal standard you hold yourself to can remain untouched. Now, consider how much of modern suffering comes from ignoring this principle. A single comment online can ruin your mood for hours. A delayed message can create anxiety loops. A change in someone else's behavior can destabilize your entire emotional state. This is not sensitivity. It is misplaced authority. You have handed control of your internal world to external triggers. Stoicism demands that you take it back, but reclaiming control does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It means becoming selectively responsive. You do not react to everything. You respond only when it aligns with reason, values, and purpose. The space between stimulus and response becomes sacred. In that space, your identity is formed, and once you start operating from this principle, something else begins to emerge. You naturally become quieter, not because you are suppressing yourself, but because you are no longer compelled to broadcast every thought or defend every misunderstanding. This is where strategic scarcity and silence begin to take shape. Most people underestimate silence because they confuse it with absence. But silence is not emptiness. It is containment of power. When you constantly explain yourself, you dilute your position. When you constantly react, you surrender leverage. When you constantly reveal your plans, you give the world a chance to interfere with them before they are fully formed. The disciplined individual understands that not everything deserves exposure. There is strength in withholding reaction. There is power in letting things unfold without immediate commentary. There is intelligence in observing more than speaking. Historically, those who maintained control over their outcomes were rarely the loudest voices in the room. They were the ones who moved without announcing every step, who refined their strategy in private, who allowed results to speak where words would have been premature. Silence is not weakness. It is delayed execution. And in a world addicted to visibility, silence becomes a form of psychological independence. When you are not constantly seeking validation through response, approval, or acknowledgement, you are no longer easily manipulated. You are no longer predictable. You become harder to disrupt. But silence alone is not enough. Without discipline, silence becomes avoidance. This is where radical self-mastery enters. Self-discipline is not about restriction for its own sake. It is about removing internal friction so that action becomes inevitable. Every time you choose distraction over focus, comfort over effort, or impulse over intention, you weaken your ability to direct your own life. Not dramatically in a single moment, but gradually through accumulation. The Stoics understood that character is not built in dramatic moments. It is built in repetition, in what you do when no one is watching, in the small decisions that seem insignificant but quietly define your trajectory. Radical discipline means refusing negotiation with your weaker impulses. It means understanding that motivation is unreliable, but structure is dependable. It means acting according to principle, even when emotion resists. And over time, this creates something most people never experience: internal trust. You begin to trust yourself because you have evidence that you do what you say you will do. That trust becomes the foundation of confidence, not the fragile kind built on external validation, but the stable kind built on consistency. Once that foundation is in place, criticism begins to lose its grip. Most people assume that confidence comes from being liked or approved of. Stoicism dismantles that illusion. If your sense of worth is dependent on external judgment, then you are permanently unstable. Because public opinion is not fixed. It shifts with mood, trend, and perspective. The Stoic approach is not to seek universal approval, but to refine internal judgment so precisely that external noise becomes irrelevant. Criticism is no longer a threat to identity. It becomes data. Praise is no longer a validation of worth. It becomes background noise. This does not happen by force. It happens when your internal standards become clearer than external commentary. When you know exactly why you act, what you stand for, and what direction you are moving in, outside opinions lose their ability to redirect you. At that point, something important changes. You stop performing for perception. You start living from principle. And that shift removes enormous psychological weight. But detachment is not complete until it is tested by adversity. Obstacles are not interruptions to the Stoic path. They are the path. Every setback, delay, rejection, or loss contains raw material for refinement. The question is not why it happened. The question is what it reveals about your ability to respond. Amor fati is not blind optimism. It is disciplined acceptance of reality as the training ground for strength. When something goes wrong, the undisciplined mind asks how to escape it. The Stoic mind asks how to use it. This is where transformation occurs, because adversity forces clarity. It removes illusions. It exposes dependence. It shows where your discipline is weak and where your perception is still reactive. Without obstacles, you may believe you are strong. With obstacles, you discover whether that strength is real. Asterisk, and here is the uncomfortable truth most people resist. You do not become unshakable by avoiding difficulty. You become unshakable by repeatedly encountering it without losing internal order. When you begin to live this way, life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes clearer. You stop interpreting discomfort as injustice. You stop treating uncertainty as danger. You stop seeing resistance as a sign to quit. Instead, you begin to recognize these things as the environment in which strength is developed. And slowly, something fundamental shifts in your identity. You are no longer someone trying to protect a fragile sense of stability. You become someone who generates stability internally, regardless of conditions. This is the foundation of unshakable detachment. Not emotional emptiness, but emotional sovereignty. Not withdrawal from life, but engagement without dependency. Not control over the world, but mastery over response. And once you see this clearly, you cannot unsee it. The question is no longer whether life will challenge you. The question is whether you will remain the same person after it does, because in the end, nothing external decides who you become. Only your response does. Asterisk, once you accept that your response is the only territory you truly own, a new kind of responsibility begins to take shape. It is heavier than motivation, more demanding than inspiration, and far less forgiving than any system of external accountability. Because now there is nowhere to hide. Not behind circumstances, not behind other people's behavior, not even behind your own emotions. Most people misunderstand this stage. They think Stoic detachment means withdrawal from intensity, but the opposite is true. It means entering intensity without fragmentation. You are no longer split between what happens and what you wish had happened. You are fully present in the reality that exists even when it is inconvenient, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it contradicts your expectations. This is where psychological endurance is built. Not in calm reflection, but in sustained exposure to pressure without internal collapse. Think of how quickly most people destabilize when outcomes shift. A plan fails, and the entire identity wavers. A relationship changes and emotional equilibrium dissolves. A career setback occurs and self-worth declines. The instability is not caused by the event itself. It is caused by the dependence placed on a specific version of reality, remaining intact. Stoicism dismantles that dependence at its root. It teaches you to stop anchoring identity to outcomes, and instead anchor it to conduct. If your identity is tied to results, you become fragile. If your identity is tied to how you think, how you choose, and how you respond, you become resilient. But this resilience is not automatic. It is trained through repetition. Every time you choose discipline over impulse, clarity over reaction, patience over emotional escalation, you are reinforcing a pattern of internal stability. And every time you abandon that pattern, you weaken it. There is no neutral ground. You are either shaping yourself or being shaped by everything around you. At this level, discipline becomes less about effort and more about identity consistency. You do not try to be disciplined. You act in alignment with someone who is. That subtle shift removes negotiation. And once negotiation disappears, excuses lose their structure. Now consider how silence evolves at this stage. Earlier, silence was strategic. Now it becomes structural. You no longer speak less just to protect outcomes. You speak less because unnecessary expression feels internally misaligned. Words begin to carry weight again. Not everything deserves articulation. Not every thought deserves release. This is not suppression. It is refinement. The mind that constantly externalizes itself becomes scattered. The mind that selectively expresses becomes concentrated. Concentration is where power accumulates. And with this concentration comes a deeper form of awareness. You begin to notice how often people are controlled by reaction loops. Someone provokes them, they respond. Someone praises them, they adjust. Someone ignores them, they seek validation. Their behavior is not self-directed. It is stimulus-driven. Stoicism interrupts that loop. It inserts space where impulse used to dominate. And in that space, something critical emerges. Choice. Not theoretical choice, but real, conscious, deliberate selection of response. This is the point where freedom becomes practical rather than philosophical. But freedom also brings, of course, discomfort. Because when you remove external blame, you are left with internal accountability. There is no longer a convenient narrative that someone else caused your reaction. You begin to see that every emotional response is filtered through interpretation. And interpretation can be trained. This is why Stoics emphasized examining impressions before accepting them. Not every thought deserves authority. Not every feeling deserves action. Some impressions are distorted by fatigue, ego, fear, or expectation. If you accept them uncritically, you lose sovereignty over your own mind. So the disciplined individual develops a habit of pause. Not delay for avoidance, but pause for clarity. What is happening here, objectively? What am I adding to it mentally? Is my reaction proportional, or is it inflated by assumption? Most people never ask these questions. They live inside their interpretations without realizing they are interpretations. Stoicism breaks that illusion, and once that illusion breaks, something unsettling appears at first. You realize how much of your suffering is self-generated, not in a dismissive sense, but in a precise psychological sense. Events occur. Meaning is assigned. Reaction follows meaning, not event. This means if meaning changes, suffering changes. That realization is powerful, but it is not comforting at first, because it removes the external justification for internal chaos. You can no longer say, "This made me feel this way," without recognizing that you participated in the formation of that feeling. But this is also where mastery begins. Because what is constructed can be reconstructed. If interpretation creates emotional state, then disciplined interpretation creates stable emotional state. At this level, adversity is no longer just a test of endurance. It becomes feedback. It shows you where your interpretation is weak, where your assumptions are fragile, where your expectations are unrealistic. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the Stoic asks, "What part of my perception is being corrected here?" This is where amor fati becomes operational, not poetic. You stop resisting reality long enough to extract instruction from it. Not passive acceptance, but active integration. You use reality as a mirror for internal refinement. And over time, something profound happens. You stop needing life to confirm your expectations in order to remain stable. You stop requiring external alignment to maintain internal order. Stability becomes independent of circumstance. But this level of detachment carries a warning that most people ignore. It can easily be misunderstood as emotional suppression or indifference. That misunderstanding leads to internal rigidity, where a person stops feeling instead of learning how to feel without being controlled by it. Stoicism is not the elimination of emotion. It is the governance of emotion through reason. Emotions still arise. The difference is that they no longer dictate direction. They inform, but they do not command. A person who cannot feel is disconnected. A person who feels but is not controlled is integrated. Integration is the goal. Now consider how this integration transforms ambition. Most ambition is reactive. It is built on comparison, insecurity, or external validation. It requires an audience, even if that audience is imagined. It feeds on visibility. Stoic ambition is different. It is internally anchored. It does not require recognition to continue. It does not collapse in absence of applause. It is sustained by principle rather than perception. This creates a different type of persistence. Not explosive, not emotional, but steady. The kind that continues when enthusiasm fades. The kind that does not depend on mood cycles. The kind that survives boredom, delay, and uncertainty. And this is where most people fail. Not because they lack intelligence or ability, but because they are dependent on emotional momentum. When momentum disappears, so does action. Stoicism replaces momentum with structure. Structure does not fluctuate. It holds even when motivation collapses. At this point, discipline becomes almost invisible. It is no longer dramatic. It is simply how things are done. There is no internal debate before action. There is alignment. And alignment reduces friction. But perhaps the most overlooked transformation is how you begin to relate to time. Without Stoic grounding, time feels fragmented. Past regrets, future anxieties, present frustrations all compete for attention. With Stoic grounding, attention collapses into the present, not as an escape, but as the only usable dimension of control. You stop living inside mental projections and start operating inside actual moments. And because only the present is actionable, your effectiveness increases naturally. This is why Stoics repeatedly return to the idea that life is only ever lived now. Not as philosophy, but as operational truth. You cannot control what is gone. You cannot control what has not arrived. You can only act where you are. And when this becomes your default mode of engagement, detachment is no longer something you practice. It is something you embody. At the end of this progression, there is no dramatic transformation that announces itself. No sudden arrival of perfect peace. Instead, there is something quieter and more durable. A stable mind under unstable conditions. A consistent character under inconsistent circumstances. A centered awareness regardless of external fluctuation. That is what unshakable detachment actually is. Not distance from life, but independence within it. Not emotional absence, but emotional authority. Not escape from difficulty, but mastery inside it. And once this is understood deeply, the question is no longer how to avoid disruption. The question becomes how much stronger you become because of it. Because in the Stoic view, nothing is wasted. Not pain, not delay, not rejection, not loss. Everything is material. Everything is usable. Everything is part of the training. And the only real failure is the refusal to engage it consciously. So the final discipline is simple, but uncompromising. Meet life directly. Interpret it clearly. Respond deliberately. And refuse to surrender your internal order to anything outside it. That is the practice. That is the test. And that is the only form of freedom that does not collapse under pressure.